Ever thought about the secret wars fought behind the lines during World War II? I mean, beyond the battles.
The shadowy stuff.
Exactly. Today, we're taking a fascinating plunge into, well, one of the key players in that shadow world, the Abwehr.
Right, the German Military Intelligence Service. Active from, what, 1920 right up until almost the end, 1944?
That's the one. And we've got a really great collection of sources for you today, historical analyses, some declassified bits, scholarly works.
Yeah, a good mix to really try and get inside this organization. Our aim, really, is to give you a clear picture of how the Abwehr worked, or sometimes didn't work, and the impact it had.
Precisely. So our mission, if you will, is to unpack this pretty complex agency for you. We want to understand, where did it come from? How did it change over time?
What were its key operations? The big wins?
Yeah.
And the pretty spectacular failures, too.
Oh, definitely. And the internal politics, the power struggles, that's a huge part of the story. And then ultimately, how effective was it? What's its legacy?
Think of this as your shortcut, maybe, to understanding a really crucial, often unseen player in the Second World War.
Okay, let's dive in then. Where does the Abwehr story actually begin?
Well, surprisingly early, actually, 1920. Which is interesting because, after World War I, the Treaty of Versailles specifically banned Germany from having any kind of intelligence organization.
Ah, so right from the get-go, they were sort of bending the rules.
Pretty much. Within the Weimar Republic's Ministry of Defense, this clandestine group popped up, and they called it the Abwehr.
Which means defense, right? Or resistance.
Yeah, translates roughly like that. In military terms, though, it usually implies counterintelligence. So that was its initial public justification, you could say.
So starting out purely defensive, counterspying.
That was the idea initially. But that started to shift around 1929. There was a key figure, General Kurt von Schleicher.
Okay.
He was instrumental in centralizing the different intelligence efforts of the Army and Navy. He brought them together under his wing within the Ministry of Defense. And that consolidation really, that's the foundation of the Abwehr as it became known later.
Okay, so it's becoming more formalized. And where were they based? Not just Berlin, I imagine.
No, it was more decentralized at first. Initially, you had Abwehr stations attached to the local army districts, the Wehrkreis, they were called.
Wehrkreis, got it.
Then, as Germany's influence grew, they set up more offices, in neutral countries, occupied territories. Eventually, though, the main HQ was established in Berlin, right next door to the OKW.
The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the Armed Forces High Command.
That's the one. So physically very close to the center of military power.
And who was actually running the show in those very early days?
Well, the first head was a Major Friedrich Gemp. He'd been deputy to Walter Nicolai, who ran German intelligence during World War I.
So experienced.
You'd think so, but apparently Gemp was considered pretty ineffective, actually. He was followed by Major Günther Schwantes, but his term was quite short, too. Seems it took a while for the leadership to really, find its feet.
Sounds like it wasn't smooth sailing initially. Were there other hurdles? Internal resistance, maybe?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting, actually. Many within the Reichswehr, the German army back then, especially the old guard, the traditional Prussian types, they were really hesitant about intelligence work. They sort of looked down on spying, saw it as, well, dishonorable, not in line with their military values of directness, sincerity.
Wow, that's a fascinating cultural clash. A military reluctant to gather intelligence.
Yeah, it created real problems finding good people in the early years. A definite challenge.
So despite these initial bumps, how did they actually organize themselves? What were the main jobs they did back then?
Well, by the late 1920s, it had grown a bit and settled into three main sections, basically. You had reconnaissance gathering info, then cipher and radio monitoring, so signals intelligence, SIGINT.
Right.
And counter-espionage, protecting Germany from foreign spies. And it's important that the Navy's intelligence staff, the Reichsmarines people, they merged with the Abwehr in 1928. That boosted things.
So consolidating naval intelligence, too.
Yeah.
And that Versailles Treaty ban on espionage.
Oh, they just ignored it, especially once the Nazis came to power. That part of the treaty was completely disregarded. They saw intelligence gathering as essential, really, given what other countries were doing.
Okay, so we've got the origins, the early structure, the initial challenges. Now things seem to heat up when this guy, Patzig, takes over. a Navy man.
Yeah, that was a bit of a surprise appointment in 1932. Captain Conrad Patzig, a naval officer, put in charge of an organization that was mostly Army personnel.
How did that go down?
Surprisingly well, actually. Patzig turned out to be quite capable. He gained respect, built useful links with foreign agencies, Lithuania, for example, against the Soviets, though he was apparently quite suspicious of the Italians, especially their codes.
Interesting. But even with this success, the other military branches still had their own intel guys.
Oh, yes. That fragmentation persisted. The Army, the Navy, the Air Force, they all kept developing their own intelligence staffs alongside the Abwehr.
And Patzig's time, it wasn't exactly conflict-free, was it? Especially with Himmler and the SS starting to flex their muscles?
No, definitely not. As the Nazis consolidated power, Patzig's Abwehr started reconnaissance flights over Poland.
Ah, provocative.
Very. And it immediately put them on a collision course with Himmler and the SS. Even some army leaders were nervous, worried it would expose their own secret plans for Poland.
So pressure from multiple sides.
Exactly. And then, in 1934, Germany signed that non-aggression pact with Poland. Hitler ordered the flight stopped, didn't want any diplomatic incidents, Plus, he wanted Poland on side, temporarily at least.
And this spat, it cost Patzig his job.
It seems so. He was dismissed in January 1935. Went off to command the pocket battleship Admiral Wilhelm, actually, his replacement. Another naval captain, Wilhelm Canaris.
Canaris. Now, there's a name that comes up a lot. What kind of situation did he walk into?
Well, Patzig apparently gave him heads up before he left. Warned him about Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich.
Heydrich of the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst?
The very same. Patzig warned Canaris that those two were aiming to take over all German intelligence. Heydrich, especially, had a really negative view of the Abwehr.
Why was that?
Partly, he blamed military intelligence failures for Germany losing World War I, whether that's fair or not is debatable. But that was his view. And partly, well, he just wanted control. He saw political intelligence as his domain.
So, right from the start of Canaris's tenure, you've got this built-in rivalry. Military intelligence versus the SS political intelligence machine.
Absolutely. A fundamental tension. How did Canaris handle it?
Well, Canaris was known for being quite slippery, a master of behind-the-scenes maneuvering. Initially, he seemed to think he could manage Heydrich and Himmler. Tried to keep things cordial,
But the rivalry didn't go away. Not at all. It simmered, sometimes boiled over, right through his time there. And it wasn't just about overall control. They competed in specific areas, too, like signals intelligence.
How so?
Well, the Abwehr had its own code-breaking section. But the Navy had its highly regarded B-Dienst listening service. And even the Foreign Office had its own communications security unit, PERS VS. It was fragmented, inefficient, really.
Sounds like a recipe for trouble. Different groups hoarding information, maybe working against each other. And didn't things get really nasty in 1937? Something about break-ins?
Yes, that was a major escalation.
Yeah.
1937. Hitler wanted to help Stalin purge the Soviet military. Bizarre, I know, but true. He ordered that the German army staff become completely unaware of ongoing German-Soviet military collaboration.
Why?
He worried that some German officers who had professional links with their Soviet counterparts might tip them off. So special SS teams, along with burglary experts apparently, broke into the secret files of both the general staff and the Abwehr.
Broke in. Serious?
Seriously. They took documents related to the German-Soviet stuff, and to cover their tracks, they started fires, including at the Abwehr headquarters.
Arson by the SS against the Abwehr.
Yes. It starkly showed the level of hostility and the lengths the SS would go to undermine the Abwehr. A really clear message.
Wow. Okay, so after that period of, let's say, formation and rising tension, Canaris reorganizes the Abwehr. What did that look like?
Yeah, the 1938 reorganization was pretty significant. Before Canaris, the Abwehr was basically just a department. He really expanded it. Personnel numbers shot up from maybe less than 150 to nearly 1,000 in just a few years. And it got more independence.
So bigger and more autonomous. How was it structured?
It was broken down into three main branches.
Okay, lay them out for us.
First, the Central Division, or Department Z. Think of it as the admin hub. Personnel, finance, paying agents, all that stuff. And crucially, it was run throughout Canaris' time by General Major Hans Oster.
Oster, another key name. Okay, what was next?
Second, the Foreign Branch Amtsgruppe Ausland. This was the liaison arm, connecting with the OKW, the Army, Navy, Air Force staffs, coordinating with the Foreign Ministry, analyzing captured documents, foreign press.
So the outward-facing part.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
And it was also the channel for requesting Abwehr support for missions. If the Army needed intelligence for an operation, they'd go through Ausland.
Right. And the 3rd Division. That's the real cloak and dagger stuff.
Exactly. That was just called Abwehr, confusingly enough. But it was subdivided into 3 crucial sections: Abwehr the 1st, 3rd, and 3.
Okay.
That was foreign intelligence collection. This had multiple subsections: Army intelligence for the West, for the East, technical intel, signals intelligence, including cryptanalysis, which became huge, eventually rivaling Bletchley Park in size, apparently, air, naval intelligence, even making false documents. A big operation.
Got it. Abwehr the 2nd.
Sabotage. Their job was to make covert contact with discontented minority groups in other countries for intel, but also for potential disruption, subversive actions. And attached to this section was the Brandenburg Regiment.
Ah, the Brandenburgers.
Special Forces, right.
Exactly. Trained for covert ops behind enemy lines. Then you had Abwehr the 3rd.
Which way?
Counterintelligence, operating inside Germany, protecting industry from spies, running disinformation campaigns, trying to penetrate foreign spy services, investigating sabotage attempts on German soil. It had lots of sub-bureaus, dealing with civilian authorities, specific spy cases, spreading fake news, handling counter-spies, even postal security.
Wow, that's comprehensive, a really sprawling structure. How did this play out on the ground, both in Germany and abroad?
Well, to make it work, they set up liaison offices directly with the Army, Navy, and Luftwaffe high commands. Within Germany, each military district had its own Abwehr station and Abwehrstelle, or Astra.
And these ASTs usually mirrored the Berlin structure. Sections for spying, sabotage, counter-espionage. They were typically run by senior Army or Navy officers who reported back to Canaris in Berlin.
But did Berlin control everything tightly?
Not really. While the overall strategy came from Canaris, often nudged by the OKW, or later Hitler himself, the local ASTs had a surprising amount of freedom. They could plan and run their own missions quite autonomously. That decentralization was a real feature of the Abwehr.
Potential for inconsistency there, maybe. And how did they find their spies, their agents?
That was often a weak point, actually. Recruitment tended to focus on quantity, not quality. It was mostly down to the local ASTs and freelance recruiters to find agents.
And these were military guys?
Mostly civilians, actually, and often, poorly vetted, poorly trained, questionable motives. It led to a lot of failures, just picking the wrong people.
Right. And how did they operate in other countries? Discreetly, I assume.
They tried. In neutral countries, they often operated undercover, attached to embassies or trade missions. They called these war organizations KOs.
KOs?
And in friendly or occupied countries, they had Abwehr substations, Osts reporting to the local Avest. But these KOs in neutral countries often got kicked out as the war went on, and the Allies put the squeeze on those governments.
So even before the war really broke out, the Abwehr was busy building networks, making contacts. What kind of things were they up to?
Oh, quite a lot. They were talking to Ukrainian groups who opposed the Soviets, engaging with Indian nationalists, fighting British rule. They even had an intel-sharing deal with Japan.
And the U.S.
They managed to get some information on American industry and military capacity, some planning data. But maybe the most significant pre-war story involves a senior Abwehr officer named Paul Thumel.
Thumel, what did he do?
Starting in 1937, Thumel, codenamed A-54, fed an absolutely massive amount of top-level intelligence to Czech agents.
Feeding intel to the Czechs. An Abwehr officer.
Yes, who then passed it straight to the British SIS in London. He gave them German military capabilities, details on the Abwehr and SD structure, nearly complete Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe orders of battle mobilization plans.
Wow.
And crucial warnings about the annexations of the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. Incredibly damaging stuff coming from inside.
That's astonishing. It speaks volumes about the internal contradictions, doesn't it? You've got the organization serving the Nazis, but key figures working against them.
It really does, and you contrast that with Hitler's own view. He famously said he preferred men of brutality over intelligence gatherers.
Didn't value intelligence much.
Seemingly not as much as brute force. Yet, despite that, the Abwehr was instrumental in paving the way for the annexation of Austria in 1938 and subverting the Czechs over the Sudetenland.
So doing the regime's dirty work.
Which, ironically, also fuels opposition within the military. Figures like General Erwin von Witzleben and Canaris himself formed a sort of conspiracy group. They were terrified Hitler's aggression would lead to another world war.
So Canaris was actively trying to prevent war, involved in coup plots.
The evidence suggests so. He tried to open secret channels to the British, convinced Hitler was heading for disaster. They even sent an emissary, Ewald von Klein-Schmenzen, to London just before the Poland invasion, trying to warn the British. a last-ditch effort.
Which failed, obviously.
It did, and in a final, deeply sinister twist, the Abwehr unknowingly supplied the radio transmitters used by Himmler and Heydrich for the Gleiwitz incident.
The fake Polish attack on the German radio station.
That's the one. The staged event Hitler used as the excuse to invade Poland. The Abwehr provided the gear, completely unaware of the real purpose.
Unbelievable. So on the eve of war, the Abwehr is this sprawling, contradictory beast. Some successes, major internal dissent, anti-Nazi leaders, yet also enabling the very start of the conflict. Okay, let's move into the war itself. Early days, some successes mentioned.
Yes, initially in the early phases, the Abwehr did show some efficiency. Operation Nordpol is often cited as their campaign against the Dutch resistance network, which was being supplied by Britain's SOE.
How did that work?
They captured an SOE radio operator and basically turned him, using his codes to infiltrate the network. It was a significant blow to the Dutch underground, at least initially.
And the invasions of Denmark and Norway, that quick success Abwehr involved there?
Heavily involved. During the Phony War, before the invasions, Abwehr agents were all over Denmark and Norway, watching shipping, which helped U-boats sink Allied vessels. More importantly, they penetrated the Danish and Norwegian military forces, got crucial information on defenses, troop locations, strength. Deep cover agents fed intel directly to the invading forces, especially the Luftwaffe in Norway.
So classic intelligence providing a military edge.
Absolutely. In those early campaigns, the Abwehr's work was arguably quite successful, contributing directly to those swift German victories. It shows they could be effective, especially in that kind of conventional warfare scenario.
Right, when the enemy was perhaps less prepared for that kind of infiltration. What about resources? Did they help secure things like oil?
Yes. There's the example of Romania in early 1940. Germany needed oil badly. The Foreign Office and the Abwehr worked together on an arms-for-oil deal.
Playing on Romanian fears.
Exactly. They pushed back against British and French influence around the Ploieti oil fields and played heavily on Romania's fear of the Soviet Union, positioning Germany as their only protector. It worked. Germany got a steady supply of cheap oil. So yes, they contributed economically there.
But it seems these early wins, like Nordpol in the Netherlands, might have been a double-edged sword. The British potentially turned it back on them.
That's a really important point. So March 41, they capture this SOE operator. They force him to transmit back to London using captured codes.
Right.
Now, the operator apparently tried to signal he was compromised slight changes in his sending style, but London missed it or ignored it. So for 2 years, the Germans ran this network, captured agents, sent fake reports back to Britain.
Looked like a huge success for the Abwehr.
On the surface, yes. But some historians, like Anthony Brown, argue British intelligence knew the radios were blown, and they deliberately used that channel to feed disinformation to the Germans.
Disinformation? About what?
Potentially about major strategic things like where D-Day would happen. So an apparent Abwehr success might actually have been part of a much larger, more successful Allied deception. It shows how tricky intelligence is. What looks like a win can hide a loss.
Fascinating. So even successes could be misleading. What about getting other countries to join the Axis, like Spain? Franco famously stayed out.
Yeah, Hitler sent Canaris himself to Madrid twice in 1940, summer, and then again in December. The mission: persuade Franco to ditch neutrality and join the fight, especially to grab Gibraltar.
But Franco wouldn't bite.
No. Spain was exhausted after its civil war, economically unstable. Franco was cautious. Canaris reported back to Hitler that Franco would only join if Britain totally collapsed, which of course it didn't. Shows the limits of espionage against hard national interests.
Right. And as the war got bigger, especially the invasion of Russia in 41, the Abwehr's intel seems to have gone seriously wrong.
Oh, drastically wrong. Their initial estimates of the Red Army's strength, way off, hugely underestimated.
Which fueled German overconfidence.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Much of the Nazi leadership and even parts of the general staff bought into this idea of a quick victory based partly on these flawed Abwehr reports. They thought the Soviets had far fewer divisions, especially modern tanks, than they actually did.
And even when the invasion started and reality hit.
Even then, their revised estimates were still way too low, maybe underestimating Soviet strength by 25%. And crucially, they completely missed the Soviet Union's mobilization potential, how quickly they could raise new armies.
Fundamental error.
Huge, especially for the German Blitzkrieg model, which relied on speed. And it wasn't just troop numbers. The maps the Abwehr provided for Barbarossa were often terrible, showing dirt tracks as major roads, things like that, wreaked havoc with logistics.
So bad intel on enemy strength, bad maps, contributing to the failure to win quickly.
Definitely a factor. That failure, combined with the unexpected Soviet resilience and those vast reserves, plus the Russian winter hitting unprepared troops. Catastrophic. Historian Klaus Fischer points to this mix. Overestimating themselves, underestimating the enemy, plus that ingrained obedience in the German military. A fatal combination.
A perfect storm of flawed intelligence and systemic issues. Now, Barbarossa also involved some horrific orders like this Commissar Order. Where did the Abwehr stand on that?
So the Commissar Order was brutal. June 41, OKW issues it. Summary execution for captured Soviet political commissars and any POWs considered politically suspect. Pure Nazi ideology, total dehumanization.
And Canaris, the Abwehr leadership.
Canaris, as head of OKW Ausland Abwehr, immediately objected, strongly. His main arguments were that it violated international law, the laws of war, and also pragmatic concerns: how would the Soviets treat German POWs in return?
So opposition on legal and practical grounds.
Yes. He and others in the Abwehr leadership were against killing soldiers and non-combatants like that, violating the Geneva Convention. It shows a real moral conflict at the top, even while the organization served the regime's broader aims.
Shifting gears completely North Africa, the Desert War. The Abwehr was active there too, but apparently it wasn't their finest hour.
North Africa was, well, generally disastrous for the Abwehr. Much like other secondary fronts, it turned into a major intelligence embarrassment.
What went wrong? Allied counterintelligence.
That was a huge part of it. The British ran some incredibly effective deception operations. There was an Italian agent the Abwehr recruited in France, codenamed Cheese.
Cheese.
Seriously.
Yep, Cheese. Turns out he was a double agent, working for British SS before the war even started. They sent him to Egypt to report on British forces. Instead, he fed the Abwehr a constant diet of carefully faked strategic intel. Hundreds of messages from a non-existent spy network.
And the Abwehr bought it. Hook, line, and sinker. This Cheese operation was a big reason the Allies achieved complete surprise with Operation Torch, the landings in North Africa in November 42.
So the landings caught the Germans completely off guard.
Totally. General Jodl, one of Hitler's top guys, admitted it later, blamed the Abwehr's compromised network directly.
Any other problems in North Africa? Recruitment?
Oh, yeah. They got desperate for agents. Started recruiting Arab POWs from French camps, promising to send them home if they spied for Germany.
How did that work out?
Badly. These guys were often poorly trained, not committed ideologically, just not very good spies. Operations run out of Tripoli by Major von Griesheim or Luftwaffe and Major Ritter's attempts to get agents into Egypt, mostly failures. Agents caught quickly, sometimes turned.
Even successful infiltrations failed.
There was Laszlo Almazy, the English patient was loosely based on his Operation Salam in 42. Successfully smuggled 2 agents across the desert into Egypt. Sounds dramatic, right? They were caught almost immediately by the British. Then there was Sonderkommando, door geologists, map makers sent to check out the terrain, pulled out right after the defeat at El Alamein.
Just one thing after another.
Pretty much. Add to that another double agent, codenamed Kiss, an Iranian recruited by the Abwehr, turned by the British and Soviets, feeding false intel about Iraq and Iran. Even a bizarre attempt to stir up trouble on the Afghan border using a local leader, the Fakir of Ibi, failed completely.
Just paints a picture of an organization completely outclassed and struggling. Makes you wonder about their commitment, the quality of their people.
It does raise questions. Assessing commitment across thousands of people is hard, but look at the top. Canaris himself, as early as March 1942, when many Germans still thought they could win, was telling General Fromm privately he thought Germany has 0 chance.
0 chance in early 42. That's revealing.
Very. And even before the U.S. was officially in the war, Canaris had targeted it for intelligence gathering. By 42, they were trying to get agents into American arms factories.
Any success there?
Not much. Their most famous attempt was Operation Pistorius, June 42. Agents sent to sabotage the U.S. aluminum industry.
Yeah.
Total disaster. All caught quickly, 6 executed. Hugely embarrassing for the Abwehr.
And they tried coercing people, too, like William Siebold.
Ah, yes, Siebold. Trap bear. He was a naturalized American citizen. The Gestapo threatened his family back in Germany to force him to spy, tasked him with setting up radio links back home.
But he didn't play ball.
Nope. As soon as he got to the U.S., he went straight to the FBI, became a double agent for them for over 18 months, operated a radio from Long Island, feeding nonsense back to Germany. The FBI even filmed his meetings with real German spies. Massive coup for the FBI, massive failure for the Abwehr.
So Allied counterintelligence was just running rings around them.
Pretty much. Not every Abwehr agent was caught, obviously, but American and British counterops were remarkably successful in neutralizing threats and often turning Abwehr operations against them.
Yet, despite these failures, Canaris himself sometimes seemed to be actively undermining Hitler, trying to stop certain operations.
There's strong evidence for that, yes. He apparently fed Hitler misleading information to help kill off the planned invasion of Switzerland, Operation Tannenbaum.
Really? Saved Switzerland?
Possibly. And he's also credited with playing a big role in persuading Franco not to let German troops cross Spain to attack Gibraltar Operation Felix. Now, Franco had his own reasons, and the SD was involved too, but Canaris' influence seems to have been crucial.
And then there's Operation Garbo. That sounds huge.
Monumental Allied success, built entirely on fooling the Abwehr. Juan Pujol Garcia, a Spaniard, volunteered for the British, became Agent Garbo. He created a completely fictional network of sub-agents all over Britain. Pure fantasy.
And the Abwehr believed it.
Totally. They thought Garbo was their top agent. He fed them meticulously crafted disinformation for years. His reports were considered gold standard intelligence by the German High Command.
And this helped with D-Day.
Massively. Garbo convinced the Germans the main Allied invasion would hit the Pas de Calais, not Normandy. Because they trusted Garbo, they kept huge forces waiting in Calais, even weeks after the Normandy landing started, critically weakened the defense in Normandy.
Incredible. Garbo must have been highly valued by the British.
So much so, he got top medals from both sides. The British decorated him, and the Germans gave him the Iron Cross, believing his fake intel was genuine. Shows the power of deception.
So we have this picture of an organization serving a brutal regime, but with leaders like Canaris actively undermining it, or at least its worst impulses. But we shouldn't see the whole Abwehr as a resistance group, right?
No, absolutely not. That's a really important point.
Yeah.
Yes, there were individuals, especially high up, who were anti-Nazi involved in resistance. But they were a small minority in an organization of thousands.
So the rest were just doing their jobs for the regime.
Or worse. Before Poland was even invaded, the Abwehr worked with the SIPO, the security police, drawing up lists for Operation Tannenberg.
What was that?
The systematic murder of tens of thousands of Polish leaders, intellectuals, priests, the elite. The Abwehr helped identify targets.
Grim.
And before Barbarossa, they were key players in the deception ops, trying to fool Britain and Russia about where the main attack was coming. They deliberately spread rumors that British warnings about the invasion were just disinformation.
Actively helping enable the surprise attack.
Yes. And there's direct complicity in war crimes, too. An Abwehr officer, Major Reason, was involved in reprisal killings of over 1,000 civilians, mostly Jews, in Crimea in '42.
So not just intelligence gathering.
No. Abwehr officers in the field, the Frontaufklärungskommando Commando III units, their jobs included counterintelligence, security, monitoring local populations, reporting on resistance. Historian Yehuda Bauer argues the Abwehr mostly put its own interests first, not saving Jews, though there are isolated stories of help, sometimes involving bribes. Then there's the Englandspiel, that Dutch SOE network compromise. Abwehr agent Herman Giskies knowingly worked with the Gestapo on that, exploiting the captured agents for years. And they failed utterly to protect the Cassia spying in Austria.
Yes, yeah.
A group working for the Allies, providing vital intel on Peenemünde rockets, tanks, aircraft, even concentration camps. They were betrayed by a double agent working for the SD, Iris, and the Abwehr couldn't or wouldn't save them. Exposed and executed.
So a really dark side, too. Resistance and complicity side by side. This internal conflict, did it lead to more direct undermining of the regime later on?
Yes, definitely. Within the command structure, anti-Nazi activity grew. General Auster, Canaris' deputy, was in regular secret contact with Allen Dulles.
The American OSS guy in Switzerland, later head of the CIA.
That's him. Auster fed Dulles info on the German resistance, coup plans, even floated the idea of a separate peace with the West. Roosevelt rejected it, demanded unconditional surrender.
And Dulles saw the writing on the wall for the Abwehr?
He predicted quite early, February '44, that the SD would swallow the Abwehr whole. He could see the SS relentlessly moving to control everything.
And the SS was actively undermining them.
Constantly. Investigating Abwehr officers suspected of plotting against Hitler, accusing Canaris of defeatism for his pessimistic reports on the Eastern Front. They even investigated the Abwehr for treason related to the attack on Belgrade. Hitler's trust was evaporating.
And they were being hit from the other side, too. Soviet penetration.
Oh, yes. The Soviets ran rings around them on the Eastern Front sometimes. NKVD agent Alexander Diminov infiltrated them in late '41 Operation Monastery. Codenamed Heine,
What did he do?
posed convincingly as part of a pro-German underground with high-level Soviet contacts, fed the Abwehr fabricated intel that influenced major battles. Notably around Stalingrad, he helped convince the Germans that Army Group Center couldn't rescue the Sixth Army, contributed to that disaster.
Wow. And there are others.
There was the Max radio deception. The Abwehr thought they had this great agent, Max, near the Kremlin, feeding them intel via white Russian émigrés. In reality, it was all an NKGB construct.
Feeding them disinformation.
Exactly. Especially about Soviet troop movements before Operation Bagration in summer '44. That led to the destruction of German Army Group Center. A huge strategic surprise, aided by Soviet deception, the Abwehr swallowed. Even late in the war, when the Abwehr was weakening, Soviet disinformation was still incredibly effective against the German high command.
It really sounds like the Abwehr was collapsing from multiple directions by late '43, early '44. Which brings us to the endgame, the Frau Sulf Tea Party. Sounds harmless.
Deceptively so. September '43, Hanta Issel, a prominent widow with anti-Nazi connections, hosted a tea party. Unfortunately, a Gestapo agent posing as a Swiss doctor infiltrated it.
Oh, dear.
Oh, dear is right. It led to the arrest of many in her circle, the Sulf Circle, in early '44. Nearly all executed eventually. Frau Sulf and her daughter were exceptions.
How did this impact the Abwehr?
Well, among those connected to the circle was Otto Kiep, a diplomat friend of Abwehr agents Erich Vermehren and his wife Elizabeth, stationed in Istanbul. When Kiep and others were arrested, the Vermehrens got a suspicious summons back to Berlin from the Gestapo, fearing the worst.
They defected.
Exactly, to the British in Istanbul. Very public defection. Coming right after the Sulf arrests, it just cemented Hitler's paranoia about the Abwehr being riddled with traitors and Allied spies.
And there was a rumor about codes.
Yeah, a mistaken belief back in Berlin that the Vermehrens had run off with vital Abwehr secret codes, added fuel to the fire. The Abwehr tried to blame the SS, the Foreign Ministry, anyone else. But Hitler had had enough.
So this was the final nail in the coffin.
Pretty much. February 1944. Hitler has a final, very tense meeting with Canaris. Reportedly, Canaris even had to agree the Abwehr was falling to bits because Germany was losing the war. Hitler fired him on the spot.
Just like that.
It's just like that. Decree issued February 18th, 1944. Abwehr abolished. Its functions, personnel, everything absorbed into the RSHA, the Reich Security Main Office. Run by Walter Schellenberg, but ultimately consolidating Himmler's total control over intelligence.
And Canaris, Ulster.
Canaris was arrested after the July 20th plot against Hitler in '44. He and Oster were both executed in the final weeks of the war. The last bits of the Abwehr were folded into AMTA 6, the SD's foreign intelligence branch within the RSHA. End of the line.
A dramatic and rather ignominious end. What about these Zossen documents mentioned in the outline? Sounds mysterious.
Yeah, the Zossen documents are a bit legendary. Supposedly a secret dossier compiled by people within the Abwehr during the war.
What was in it?
Allegedly detailed proof of Nazi war crimes in Eastern Europe. The idea might have been to keep a record, maybe for post-war use, who knows. They were supposedly kept in a safe at the Abwehr HQ complex in Zossen near Berlin.
And what happened to them?
Well, the story goes that as the end neared, Werner Schrader, who was later involved in the July plot and killed himself, buried the documents near Zossen to keep them out of Soviet or SS hands.
Did it work?
Apparently not. The Gestapo found out about them. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, head of the RSHA after Heydrich, reportedly had them dug up, taken to Schloss Mittersel in Austria, and burned.
Burned. What else was lost?
It's believed Canaris' personal diaries were part of the haul, along with other papers that could have implicated many high-ranking Germans. Their destruction certainly erased a lot of potentially crucial historical evidence.
Okay, so we've traced this whole complex story: origins, evolution, operations, contradictions, demise. What's the final verdict from historians? How effective was the Abwehr, really? What's its legacy?
Well, the general consensus among historians isn't great, frankly. Most agree the Abwehr had a poor reputation for the quality of its work. It was seen as decentralized, often inefficient.
And that rivalry with the SS didn't help.
Made things much worse. That constant infighting with the RSHA and SD was incredibly damaging. Plus, you absolutely cannot forget the Allied success with Enigma. Bletchley Park breaking German codes consistently undermined Abwehr operations.
So external factors played a huge role. What do specific historians say?
Robin Winks called the Abwehr an abysmal failure, particularly pointing to their inability to predict major Allied landings. Hugh Trevor Roper was scathing. Rotten with corruption, notoriously inefficient, politically suspect, blaming Canaris' negligent rule, suggesting he was more interested in anti-Nazi plotting than running an effective spy agency.
Though Canaris wasn't a Nazi enthusiast, right?
No, Norman Davies and others agree on that. But Trevor Roper saw the Abwehr as a happy parasite early in the war, benefiting from Wehrmacht victories but collapsing when things got tough.
Yeah, and the operational record.
Max Hastings claims their espionage was uniformly unsuccessful, apart from maybe suborning some Yugoslav officers. Numerous intel failures contributed directly to German military disasters. Yes, there were some early successes, the Anschluss, grabbing that tunnel in Czechoslovakia,
Yeah.
but overall, not impressive.
What about the idea of it being a center of resistance?
Walter Görlitz argued Canaris and the Abwehr were the real center of military opposition, but that's a view many historians dispute. Alan Dulles, who knew them well, reckoned maybe only the very top leaders were active dissenters. He estimated 95% of Abwehr personnel were actively working against the Allies.
So the overall assessment.
Generally, that the Abwehr displayed no great efficiency either as intelligence officers or as conspirators. Remember, the British ran at least 19 double agents through them, feeding them lies. The Soviets infiltrated them heavily.
And Hitler's own influence.
Crucial. Historian Albert Seaton noted Hitler's opinions often just dictated intelligence assessments, regardless of the facts. Max Hastings makes a similar point about totalitarian systems. Intelligence often has to fit the leader's narrative.
So wrapping it all up.
Despite some early activity, the Abwehr's historical reputation is pretty poor. A mix of internal problems, intense external pressure from friend and foe alike, and the incredibly toxic political environment of Nazi Germany.
So to recap for everyone, the Abwehr starts defensively, gets transformed under the Nazis, is riddled with conflict and inefficiency, has some early wins but way more significant failures later, and finally gets dissolved by the SS.
That sums it up pretty well.
And the really surprising things are those anti-Nazi elements coexisting with complicity and just how thoroughly the Allies seem to have penetrated them. It really makes you think, doesn't it? How much does the effectiveness of any spy agency depend on the political system it's part of?
That's a huge question. Or maybe, what lessons are there in the Abwehr's failures? About the dangers of overconfidence, infighting, letting ideology blind you to reality when you're trying to gather intelligence.
Definitely food for thought. If you want to dig deeper into this, we really encourage you to check out the sources we've mentioned or look for other works on World War II intelligence.
There's a lot more out there if you want to understand this complicated, often contradictory piece of history.